So, all right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dylan, and I'm going to be co-moderating our discussion tonight on reparations with Kayla. First, want to thank you for joining the NYU's Black Student Union and the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora for our panel conversation tonight. We're going to be focusing on the urgency of reparations for Black people living in the United States. And our hope for this event is that it helps to clarify what the demand for reparations means in our present political moment, but then also to historicize how the call for reparations exists within a larger history of Black resistance to the harms of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and the institution of American chattel slavery. We titled this event the End the War on Black People, which comes from the Movement for Black Lives policy platform and stems from our own recognition that the United States government has continuously engaged in both named and unnamed wars on Black communities, which are actively taking place today. This is the context under which we are all convened. Just as a brief note on structure, Kayla and I will be posing questions both to the entire panel and specific panelists to answer over the next about hour and 15 minutes. And then we're going to be devoting the last 15 minutes or so to answer any questions from the audience. So as you're listening, if there's a question that pops into your mind, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom throughout the conversation, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the later half of this event. And so now I'm going to throw it over to Kayla, who can introduce you to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Dylan. So I have the pleasure of introducing our three faculty panelists for our event today. And first we have Dr. Michael Ralph. He teaches in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, as well as at the School of Medicine for New York University. His research integrates political science, economics, history, and medical anthropology through an explicit focus on debt, slavery, insurance, forensics, and incarceration. He built the multimedia archive treasury of Weary Souls, which is the world's most comprehensive ledger of insured enslaved people. He has an undergraduate degree in Africana Studies from Morris Brown College and a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Chicago. Next, we have Dr. Vasuki Nesiah. She is a legal scholar with a focus on public international law. Her main areas of research include the law and politics of international human rights and humanitarianism, with a particular focus on transitional justice. She has published widely on the history and politics of human rights, humanitarianism, international criminal law, international feminisms, and colonial legal history. Her current research focuses on reparations. Originally from Sri Lanka, she earned her BA in philosophy and government from Cornell University and earned her JD and SJD from Harvard Law School. Next, we have Dr. Michael Funk, who is a proud alumnus of the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, where he received his MA from the Department of Administration, Leadership, and Technology. His scholarship primarily focuses on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. He is a Steinhardt Knowledge Partner that works with faculty to support efforts toward creating inclusive classroom settings. In 2012, he received his doctorate from the University of Massachusetts Amherst Social Justice Education Program. And on NYU's campus, he's been affiliated with the Academic Achievement Program, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Scholars Program, and currently serves as a faculty fellow in residence at the First Year Residence Hall Founders. So next we'll have Dylan to open us up with questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kayla. Just to get things started and just so clear on definitions for folks in the audience, I'm going to ask for each of our panelists in your own words to define reparations.
Well, I mean, I think of reparations as a strategy for managing injury, as a way of sort of healing breaches in the social contract, so to speak, or the kind of unwritten agreements we have and how we relate to each other. So, I think reparations is an important issue to raise whenever there's been a kind of injury, because I associate reparations with redress of an important kind of injury.
Shall I go next? Yeah, I mean, I think of reparations, kind of as sort of as an argument that we carry our history with us, to use sort of Baldwin's phrase, that and that reparations and that notion of carrying our history with us is for me at the core of reparations claims. And certainly there is this notion that Michael Ralph spoke to, that of reparations as redress, perhaps is with the connotation of repair and making things whole. There's also a different notion of reparations, I think, which I sort of lean towards more, which is a way of thinking about reparations that's linked to the words sort of refuse or reject or a rejoinder. And for me, it is this latter conception. So reparations as refusal rather than reparations as repair that has particular resonance in some sense. That for me, reparations is a fundamentally political rather than ameliorative, and it's interested in opening new directions for solidarity rather than bringing closure on the past. So instead of emphasizing repair, I may emphasize social change, I guess.
Yeah, I would say similar to what all the panelists are saying. I think reparations to me is, in the word it denotes, is a repairing or a corrective action where the apologizer is declaring that in spite of what they have done, they're no longer their person. So a number of ours, I think of rehabilitation or restitution. I think of, and particularly, restorative justice. And it also denotes repentance. So ownership for a wrongdoing or an action that has harmed or impacted an individual or a group of individuals or a collective group of individuals. And so in terms of reparations, I think it's, for me, I like to expand on it in the sense of my own relationship to it and thinking about it over the years. It's not my scholarship, but it's something I think quite about. And so for me, when I was, and many of you who are undergrads now in the 90s, growing up kind of in the hip hop era, you know, we were really situated in Afrocentricity, and you had the native tongues and hip hop. And I remember learning a lot through kind of hip hop, through Chuck D, talking about Chesimard and Farrakhan, and through the Final Call. I remember in terms of reparative justice through, you know, if you look at the Final Call and the Nation of Islam's, they have the very top of 4 calls to actions are looking for freedom, justice, equity. And if that can't happen, then redistribution of land. So giving us some land reform in Georgia or the coast of South Carolina, where give us folks who have been incarcerated, let us kind of build our own communities collectively and give us the monies and the resources to do so. You know, 2001, I think of Randall Robinson, who wrote The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks. So thinking of it as economic justice. You know, I also think of, you know, reparations, I think, is a term that is often misunderstood and also often framed as a zero sum total. So for someone to get something for wrongdoings, it means taking away something from someone else. And you know, I think of back, some of you might more contemporarily think of the Chappelle Show. They did an episode on reparations in 2003, and you see kind of Black folks, they just, you know, make a mockery of kind of going out and buying ostentatious things or material goods and kind of basically not making the most of money of the reparations. And I think it really does a disservice when we think of what reparations is about. And more commonly now in the discourse of Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations, Nicole Hannah-Jones' recent article, What is Owed, several scholars like William Darity, who just recently came out with a book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And then of course, Sheila Lee, Jackson Lee's Moore Commission of, you know, the HR 40 Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposal, which is important to put into context. This is an idea to begin a discussion about the possibilities of it that was first proposed in 1989, which is quite some time ago. And today, even today, it still hasn't been voted on the floor by Congress, by either the House or Senate.
Thank you all so much for your answers and responses. So this next question is also for everyone and anyone to answer, and it's 2 parts. So the first one is, in the wake of global uprisings against racist police violence from Nigeria to South Africa to here in the United States, What does reparations look like for various African diasporic communities living in the United States?
Does anyone have a preference? Well, I don't mind starting. I think what do reparations look like? I think there's many levels to this question, and I'm sure over the course of this conversation, we'll have an opportunity to explore them. One thing that comes to mind right away is sort of who qualifies for reparations. I think that's an interesting question. And I think part of what the reparations debate has offered us is an opportunity to think about the different kinds of injustice, the different histories of injustice, as Vasuki was pointing out. And I think that, there's been an interesting kind of, at times, fracturing of the kind of African diasporic community. Increasingly, there's sort of debates, it seems, about whether all Black people experience injustice the same way or share the same kind of history of injury. Um, it takes sometimes the form of people making sharp distinctions between people whose ancestors are descendants of slavery in the US versus people who are from the Caribbean, Latin America, or the African continent and who've come over as immigrants or something like that. On some college campuses, actually, among students, there's like the idea of the descendants, using this term of sort of people whose ancestors were enslaved in the US, in the plantation South, versus like people whose parents came at other moments. And I think on the one hand, obviously, there's something distinct in particular about someone whose history goes back several generations and who was here and his ancestors were legally enslaved in the US. At the same time, I think we would also acknowledge that different people who come to the US since that time who are racialized as Black suffer all kinds of injustices that are worthy of redress, worthy of repair, worthy of sort of conceptualizing within the framework of reparations. And I'm interested in the question of how we might grapple with both of these issues. The fact that there's a distinct historical experience we're often referring to or gesturing toward when we talk about reparations, but also other kinds of injustice that we want to think through and also sort of potentially remedy. And I also want to think about what that conversation means in the context of, like, Pan-Africanism and decolonizing projects and anti-colonial projects, which often were about sort of drawing together different people who are suffering from slavery, colonialism, imperialism of various kinds, rather than sort of fracturing those communities, but sort of drawing lessons and insights from each other and sort of building a broad coalition. And in some parts of the world, that even includes South Asians, like in the UK, people understood to be victims of British Empire, or in the work of Sir Hilary Beckles, he's in a book called Britain's Black Debt. He's one of the leading researchers on the sort of Caribbean and CARICOM reparations lawsuit against European enslavers. Um, his book includes an account of the way indigenous people were dispossessed and had their land seized and victims of genocide in the context of building the plantation system that was central to the transatlantic slave trade. So there we have a sort of appreciation for the role of indigenous people in this conversation about reparations as well. So I just want to throw some of those things out there, but I think it's a very interesting question. Like, how do we grapple with reparations in the context of these different forms of difference that are sort of entangled, but not necessarily equivalent to each other?
Yeah, I could take off from there. I mean, I agree with Michael. I thought that was really helpful in thinking about reparations, as sort of a series of sort of nested conversations. So there's a conversation that's particular to the very particular historical experience of the US. And then there's a Pan-African conversation, and then there's a conversation of the Global South. More generally, and it's about, and I think in some sense, reparations can take many forms and can in some sense speak to all of those histories in different kinds of ways and different kinds of interventions. So in the US, for instance, where I think of reparations as being really about dealing with the afterlives of slavery, the abolition is one place where we need to begin thinking about reparations. So that both reparations and the political violence scale, as you mentioned, that these are intertwined conversations, and in how we deal with those with the afterlife of slavery will take many different forms, but certainly abolition seems to be one. I was thinking outside of the imagination of the carceral state. seems to be one important place in which to begin the reparations conversation here. How then we connect the dots between this problem space and what's going on in Nigeria and South Africa and elsewhere. So carcerality may be one powerful name of racial oppression in the US, but in Nigeria, it may be something else. For instance, in many parts of the global South, the terms of trade and aid may be equally powerful names for racial oppression. And certainly the CARICOM countries, for instance, the Caribbean countries have come together, are calling for various kinds of rethinking of debt, sovereign debt in terms of reparations. There's a movement in Haiti, as many of you know, that speaks to links reparations and questions of debt. So I guess part of what I want to emphasize is that reparations is about how our past lives in the present. And what I want to, in that sense, that we need to attend to time and place in tracing the sort of many lives of genocide, colonialism, and the international slave trade in terms of how the past lives in the present. And perhaps if I can go on sort of one detour on one particular thing, you mentioned South Africa as well. So it is a country that has instituted, Mike Funk and I were discussing just before we started, has instituted a reparations program that I think of as an example in some ways of the dangers of seeing reparations as purely ameliorative justice, injection of cash, a sort of a completely individualized financial pill to repair and heal. So in South Africa, following the Truth Commission, the government announced a payment of 30,000 Rand as reparations payments for each of the 18,000 people who are identified as victims and beneficiaries through the Truth Commission process. 30,000 Rand is about $2,000 today. Maybe it was a bit more in the early 2000s when people received their checks. But still, it is a pitiful sum. If one looks at how the history of colonization and apartheid lives in the present, then we can say that 30,000 Rand is a joke. It is an insult to the radical potential of reparations in some sense. And so it is a story, I think, with a caution that we don't want reparations itself to get absorbed into a framework of reconciliation and amelioration that derails and distracts from interventions seeking structural change, and really grappling with the histories of colonialism, slavery, genocide against indigenous people. Certainly we don't want reparations to be weaponized in ways that pits legally eligible beneficiaries, like those 18,000 Truth Commission identified people, against a larger community of victims. South Africa is a country of almost 60 million people, of which almost 45 million are Black. And so 18,000 again, getting as the beneficiaries of reparations from the Truth Commission process. Yeah, again, it seems it's a caution about how the reparation conversation can go wrong in some sense.
Yeah, and I don't think there are simple answers to complex questions. It's kind of the who and the how. I think there's been a playbook historically of who is slaveable in the United States, and the United States have followed the one-drop rule, hypodescent, right? And so that makes a lot of folks eligible, right? And if we're not talking about chattel slavery, we're talking about Jim Crow era. I mean, we're talking about 80% of folks from the African diaspora's time in the United States, 80% have either been wrapped up in either chattel slavery or Jim Crow, right? So these are centuries worth of debt. And I think it matters kind of what kind of reparations are we talking about? Are we talking about economic, going to individuals or groups or institutions? Are we talking about symbolic? And so for me, reparation is really reckoning with the past and excavating the US's original sin, which is slavery. I think Williams Faulkner talks about the past is never dead. It's not even the past. Or if we think of the proverb of Sankofa, right? This notion it's not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. So in many ways, we see symbolically, and there's psychological benefits to having reparations that are done symbolically. I think of even just in our backyard, you have the Ark of Return that is at the United Nations, that is really paying homage to and in honor of the 13 million folks who died in the transatlantic slave trade, right? And then 15% of them that never even made it to the shores of the United States or the Caribbean. You think of the African burial ground downtown, where 15,000 bodies were exhumed, right? So really paying knowledge and taking ownership to the history of slavery. Juneteenth, even as an acknowledgement, right? I'm really, in terms of symbolic reparations, I think NYU should build a statue of Bree Newsom, right? I think that should be our own Iwo Jima, taking down the Confederate flag, right? And so I think those are tangible, doable. And I think there's mechanisms now. Now William Darity argues folks that can, demonstrate anywhere from 10 to 15 years of identifying as Black in some categorical aspect. So whether it's through applications, through the census, right? There's ways that people have kind of demonstrated they're Black, they appear as Black. That's the important piece, integral piece of their identity. So I think there's other ways with Ancestry.com now, 23andMe, there's ways in terms of being able to track histories of folks who have ancestors and lineage to it. But more immediately, for me, and I think we'll probably move more into the prison industrial complex, is kind of what's most urgent and pressing. For me, just yesterday in New Jersey is the 14th state as of yesterday to pass the legalization of marijuana. Right. And so the laws that are now happening are based on and how they're creating legislatives and policies that are getting created was really around this notion of social equity. And so folks who have been criminalized in the past, they should have their records expunged, decriminalized. But what's happening is, and I think of, it's reminiscent of the empowerment zones in Harlem, where really big businesses are swooping in and taking over the cannabis industry already. And so of the 100% of licenses that were offered, less than 10% are going to BIPOC folks, right? And so it's just a recreation where there's literally, and I think in New York, April 21st is the date where they're going to vote on the legalization of marijuana. How can we really take this time right now and start essentially creating wealth in terms of industries, particularly people who have been wronged by policies that we see as unjust?
Yes, I really love all of those responses, and it really lends well into the second part of this question. So, Vasuki, thinking about what you were saying about how our past lives in the present, and then Dr. Funk, what you were talking about in terms of the exact forms of reparations, and thinking about just so many systems like police, the prison industrial complex, medical racism, housing injustice that have really been at the forefront of this COVID-19 pandemic. I was wondering what you all thought about which form or forms of reparations you feel are the most urgent or pressing in this political moment of COVID-induced crisis. And anyone can start.
Yeah, maybe I can start maybe a little bit of that conversation. Lots of things that were seen as pipe dreams even a year ago. I think after last summer, the defunding the police, these have become these have become sort of things that dinner table conversations. People know what these mean. There's a way in which I think we need to seize the moment, right? There's a particular political window of opportunity in this moment, and then there are very concrete steps that could be taken within a broad framework of reparations, which I see as not just financial, but a whole range of structural things that shows how white supremacy is sort of baked into sort of everyday institutional arrangements. So, Mike's example of marijuana laws, drug laws is one of those things, defunding the police, the Green New Deal, other actions of dismantling the sort of carceral state. These are all steps, I think, that one can understand within a sort of complex reparation framework. And so that there's a ways in which you, I guess my, like what Ruthie Gilmore says about abolition, that whatever action we need to think has to be red, green, and international. I think of reparations as being like that as well. It has to be red, green, and international, and addressing the maldistribution of wealth foregrounding the environmental horizon from polluted water in Flint to the wildfires in the West, to the public health crisis, as you mentioned, Kayla, with COVID, situating sort of our utopias in terms of sort of radical international solidarities, again, as Black Lives Matter has done with Palestine, that sort of take on, in some sense, the fact that on the one hand, we're thinking of justice within the US, on the other hand, the US itself, the US empire itself is a vehicle for continued injustice in many ways. And I think the value of the Ta-Nehisi Coates article in the Atlantic some years back, that it showed how these injustices of slavery, how the past is reproduced and morphed into sort of wild new forms of sort of post-emancipation policies and programs related to sort of everyday things that are on the congressional floor every day, from like banking policy to housing policy. And so when we see legislation can be the vehicle of making the history of slavery present, it can also then be the vehicle to fight back. So one vehicle amongst many, and certainly perhaps a sideshow to the social movements, but maybe an important sideshow to those movements, and one that what can be a mutually reinforcing dynamic, I think, between it.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I think, in terms of the impact or how reparations relates to COVID and other sort of recent crises, the conversation we've been having made me reflect on, I guess, the role of infrastructure as something that sort of facilitates social mobility or inhibits social mobility. And much of the infrastructure we live with was institutionalized in the antebellum era and the era of the slave trade, but also in ways that has implications both for people of African descent in the US and also throughout the world. Like I was thinking about, recent scholarship on the role of US banks, in particular Citibank in the Caribbean in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. And the role of various U.S. corporations or global corporations who benefited from colonialism in Africa and the post-colonial context of Africa, right? Such that if U.S. firms are benefiting from economic exploitation in the Caribbean and in Africa, then there is an argument that groups from those parts of the world are deserving of redress and amelioration and restoration and all kinds of sort of forms of repair from U.S. Companies. But in terms of COVID specifically, I think that what the COVID crisis obviously made clear was that there are huge discrepancies in our society around healthcare, but not just healthcare, also logistics, transportation, and then all these things are compounded by sort of the carceral state. And most acutely, we had, for instance, an NYU graduate student who was formerly incarcerated, who was doing an MA, who had a traffic violation during the height of the pandemic, and his traffic violation was interpreted as a parole violation, and he was sent to Rikers Island at the height of the pandemic. And when he got to Rikers Island, there was no sanitizer, no masks. Although people who were incarcerated were asked to produce sanitizer, they weren't allowed to even use it or have it because it has alcohol in it, So he was just sort of really drawn right back into the kind of this web of sort of grief and suffering. And I think that, thankfully, because of his network, he was able to, be extracted from that scenario. But there are countless others who suffered and who died, obviously, during the pandemic as a result. And so I think, COVID just sort of raises our attention, it sort of draws our attention even more acutely to the kind of lingering struggle to kind of have infrastructure that's provides mobility in the same ways to all people. And that's so often sort of central to the way people are exploited and alienated. And I guess one last thing I'll mention, because I think it's really interesting in terms of what Mike was saying about land. I think land, and then the question of debt and the question of like the tax code or ability to access or not access business loans and all those things has also been sort of, I guess, thrown into sharp relief during the pandemic, because a lot of businesses have struggled, but others have sort of made out like bandits, just sort of taking business loans that are really business grants, that are sort of forgiven, and they go on and they claim the loans are for payroll, but then they take it and put it in the stock market, and they're making the stock market is going to record highs and things like that. Meanwhile, smaller businesses are suffering, and other people just can't even are struggling to have decent credit, much less get access to loans and things like that. So I think, COVID sort of has reminded us just about how steep the inequality is, but also how reparations can offer us a path to a more equitable society. And I think that, to Vasuki's point, reparations should not be weaponized against structural change, as she said. It should be, I think, instead part of a way we reconceive what governance can be, actually, right? Like, I think what we're essentially talking about when we talk about reparations is the kind of governance we want, and like how we can make a claim on the government for the kind of rights and entitlements we believe we deserve. And those things, once we institutionalize them, will benefit all people. To Mike's point, that reparations doesn't mean that some benefit and others miss out. Instead, it means that the injustice that some had to suffer through can be the basis for transforming society in a way that benefits all people.
Yeah, and for me, in terms of restorative justice, I think the U.S. has done a profound job of gaslighting uh, blacks in the United States. I mean, we're talking about a government that's apologized a total of 6 times for wrongdoings to collective groups of folks. We get on Trump for not apologizing in 4 years, but he has a playbook that he's operating from, right? And so, we apologize for collusion and aiding and abetting some Gestapos from Nazi Germany. We've apologized for the coup and the ultimate annex of the Hawaiian Queendom at the time. We've apologized for the Tuskegee experiment, right? The untreated, close to 400 Black men who didn't know that they were not being treated at the time in unethical studies. We apologized to Japanese, rightfully, for Japanese internment, and there was economic payment, restitution for it. Japanese Americans received $20,000. So there's a monetary precedent for wrongdoings. And buried in a bill, in a House bill, there's apology to indigenous folks for genocide in America. And then also the Congress apologized one time for the enslavement of Africans, right? And so I think there needs to be a lot more ownership in terms of, again, the US being accountable for actually the crimes of slavery. And so I think that hasn't been reconciled first. And so I do think economic, I think there needs to be some monetary gains, but I think there are things without sending necessarily a paycheck that can benefit folks monetarily. So for instance, loan forgiveness. I mean, that's on the table already. It just seems like a no-brainer that folks who are able to have connections with to slavery should not only necessarily maybe be waived the taxes, but for certainly loan forgiveness, education, having access. I mean, we have right now in New York State, you have the Excelsior initiative, right, where state and city schools are basically for essentially free tuition, right? So how can't that be operationalized at a federal level? And I think part of what the issue is, or the trick is kind of public versus private sectors. And you see oftentimes private sectors are able to make more redress or amends in terms of reparations. But in the public sector, I think what obfuscates it oftentimes is this notion of the 14th Amendment, right? And so Randall Kennedy has a book called For Discrimination, right? And so I think the 14th Amendment gets misinterpreted, and often purposely, where it's really protecting folks from subordinate behavior or discrimination or oppressive behaviors. But it's not necessarily in terms of supporting. So for instance, Pell Grants are a form of, right, positively supporting folks with tuition based on income. But for whatever reason or another, when it comes to race, it becomes a violation of the 14th Amendment. So I think we need to rethink or reimagine how we're even interpreting that and making sense of it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of your insights. I think something that's particularly sticking with me is this idea of like the past lives in the present as we're like engaging with these the afterlives of chattel slavery. And also on this note, this question is specifically for you, Dr. Ralph, this idea that you brought up as like reparations as a path and how it shouldn't be weaponized against movements for structural change. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you would envision calculating reparations, just given your work on debt, insurance, incarceration, and then also talk a little bit about what does restitution and compensation for both historical, but then as has been mentioned earlier, ongoing harms against Black people in the US.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to, acknowledge that in many ways I feel like I was building on what Vasuki is saying in terms of this particular tension people sometimes sort of offer about like reparations versus structural change. And in fact, it's about sort of bringing them together. But I think, on the question of reparations, we've sort of touched on symbolic gestures and sort of other forms of repair, restoration that aren't really financial. But I do want, and I appreciate the question because I sort of want to dig into the financial part because I'm very much interested in the financial part, in part, not just because I think that the finances resolve the other kinds of concerns, but it's only because I think that actually what accounting is a kind of way of thinking about history, and accounting is actually a kind of an imaginative process. It's not really literal in the way people think of it. Like what does an accountant do for the wealthy, for instance, is sort of have them conceptualize all kinds of ways that what they're doing has value, or what they're doing is deserving of a sort of tax break or something like that. And I think in the same way we should use our imagination to think about all the ways that kind of injury and suffering can be compounded over generations, and therefore all the ways in which people deserve redress for that, And in that sense, I think often when I think of reparations, I really like to approach it in a kind of actuarial way, because I sort of try to bracket the moral and philosophical questions, and I think of it really in a kind of pragmatic and actuarial way in the sense. And what I mean by that is that, like, I think of it almost like a car accident or something, right? Like a car accident happens, and we see the collision. What we now want to know is who's liable, and then we decide like what the transfer of value will be, like who's hurt, who's injured, who's liable. And so I think since we all can agree, because when it comes to the kind of philosophical question, people say, yeah, slavery was awful, but how could you ever put a price on it? Like, or who exactly is responsible, or who exactly does it go to? But I think that even though we would say something like human life is so precious, we cannot really put a monetary value on it. We do it all the time. If God forbid someone gets in an awful car accident, right, within days, not hours, there'll be some kind of forensic inquiry, and then people will just cut a check and send it to the family of the deceased, or the person who's out of work for X amount of time will get a check based on the projected wages missed, based on the injury, etc. So even as we know that this is inadequate, we do it all the time. And if we do it all the time, why can't we do it for something that we think of as this astonishing kind of injury, So I think for me, like forensic accounting is like a particular kind of history that's very pragmatic, that allows us to think in imaginative ways about value and about what people owe to each other. And I think that's a very useful for thinking about reparations. And I guess to go a little further, I would say what this could lead to is, let's say, I think it's fair to say that the sum of money that was generated by the transatlantic slave trade and the sort of compound interest on that over generations is like billions and billions of dollars. So what if we sort of arrive at this figure? We bring together actuaries and historians and things like that, and we discover that, okay, the U.S. government owes billions of dollars to people of African descent. What that might mean is not that people would get a check, but that people can essentially draw down on that credit, so to speak, that, and I think it's a useful exercise to say, like, what would it mean to think that the US government owes something to African Americans rather than the reverse, which is what people often say. That people kind of have this, like, the kind of welfare queen mythology and that kind of thing. But like, what if the government essentially is saying, look, African Americans and people of African descent, or other sort of people who suffered historical injustices, have this kind of account they can draw down on for healthcare, for education, for college tuition, for various things that we think of as essential to social mobility or essential to life. What that would seem to be is almost like tallying the debt of injustice could lead to a different kind of society, almost like a socialist society, right? Because it means that governance would have to be completely reorganized if all people of African descent or all people of color are essentially going to school for free, or essentially have free healthcare, or essentially have free access to libraries and museums. That's an entirely different kind of society that we've been able to achieve by having a thoughtful accounting of this debt. You know what I mean? So I think for me, being really imaginative about the accounting helps us to translate that into a vision for the kind of society we'd like and the kind of governance we're seeking.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Ralph. So my next question is for Dr. Funk. Given that we are kind of all gathered here because we are in some way connected to NYU, which is an institution, an educational institution. I was wondering what you think the call for reparations looks like within the secondary and post-secondary educational landscape.
So I think there are conversations in some ways, and I think it should be the case where higher education serves as a beacon in terms of being at the vanguard of not only studying these issues, but taking actions. Currently, there are 40 college consortium right now. 40 is an important language. I think of 40 acres and a mule that was not promised. You know, I think of thinking of Martin Luther King, his whole kind of analogy of walking to the Capitol with an insufficient fund check, right? And so again, owed debt to us. And so the University Studying Slavery Fund, and this includes places, I think it started in Brown a number of years ago, I think in 2003. Virginia picked it up in a number of Virginia schools. I think also next to us, Columbia is also involved, Georgetown, Princeton as well. So many universities are currently making amends for their hand in chattel slavery. So for instance, Georgetown, I think they sold and made money and actually were able to stay afloat from the selling of enslaved Africans. I think of the amount of 292 enslaved Africans, right? And so now they're creating, I think as a collective, which I think is great in terms of democratic process, students have opted into paying $27 worth of their tuition to set aside some type of restitution for ancestors of those enslaved Africans. In addition, now they're reestablishing legacy. So folks who are from African descent in that sense, particularly within the US context, are now being seen in terms of admissions and kind of, and they're in the same ilk of legacy. The same is true with Princeton. I think they've set aside $27 million for programmatic faculty recruitment, and as well as recruitment and retention of students of color and faculty. So there's ways that now it's not enough, but I think what's happening is there's earmarked initiatives that are happening. And so what still remains to be the issue though, is if you think of, usually we think of persistence in 6 years in terms of 6 years. And so Blacks are still like graduating at 50%, 51% graduation rate in 6 years, whereas whites are still doing it, graduating at 70%. Blacks who graduate from college still have less wealth than whites that drop out of college, right? Whites who graduate actually have 7 times more wealth than Blacks. So if we're looking in terms of really closing the wealth gap between Blacks and their white counterparts, I think we have to think of more long-term strategies. In some ways, affirmative action policies were addressing it, but now you have at least 10 states that are anti-affirmative action. Just recently in California, Proposition 16 had an opportunity to repeal Proposition 209, but it wasn't passed, right? And we can't even get towards affirmative action, let alone reparations, right? Which becomes a real issue. And even affirmative action in language, I think of the NFL, right? NFL has a Rooney Rule, has affirmative action policies in place, but there's only literally 2 Black head coaches in right, in an industry that has over 75% Black players in it, right? So practice and theory, I think there's a real issue. I mean, I think of even NYU, right, which is, I think it's touted as the second most diverse institution in the United States, only next to New York Institute School of Technology, New York School of Technology. And so even at NYU, it's the all-time high of Black students, and we're at, I think we're at 12%, right? So we're just barely reaching the demographics of our population, which is 13%. In fact, we're still underrepresented. If you think of, and if we look at New York City, we're wildly underrepresented, where there's 25% Blacks, right? And so I think it's really important, and simultaneously, at places like NYU, Blacks tend to have higher graduation rates than their white counterparts. There are programmatic support. So I think we need to really be innovative and creative about not only recruiting students, but also retaining students, making sure they persist. And I think initiatives, and again, it's really in terms of funding, I think earmarking need-based scholarships for students of African descent who have lineage to um, ancestors who were enslaved. I think those are really important beginning places, not ending places, but beginning places in higher education. Because if we can't get it right in higher education, we're in deep, deep trouble.
Thank you so much, Dr. Funk. I think something I was reflecting on as you were talking to, right, and thinking about earmarking funds is also what Dr. Ralph mentioned, and thinking about accounting as an imaginative process too, and how our society already kind of like puts a value on life, but we're unwilling to do that for Black Americans and when it comes to the issue of reparations. So thank you so much for offering that. Shifting focus a little bit, this question's for Professor Nesiah. I was hoping you could contextualize the historical use of reparations when we think beyond the US. I know we've touched on this a little bit already, but wanted to provide a little more space to talk about different specific examples and how whether it's labeled truth and reconciliation commissions or restorative justice bodies have been used in other regions post-conflict. And then what does this mean and kind of lessons we can learn for what are often state-sanctioned processes?
Sure. Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, I mean, so the international human rights law, on the one hand, it recognizes a right to reparations whenever there has been a human rights violation. There are, depending on where it's invoked, there are other kinds of constraints about procedural constraints that shape when such a right, what the life of such a right means. So this is both a right that victims have and a concomitant obligation on states have to deliver on that right. However, there are questions of statute of limitations. There are a whole range of different kinds of things that become part of the question. I mean, recently, or a few years ago, 2013, if I remember right, for instance, there was a case in England that tested the limits of how long you can go back. So there was a case of, during British colonialism in Kenya, a case of torture of people arrested and tortured because they were part of the Mau Mau rebellion, they were, and survivors were given some compensation for the British courts, a radical judgment in some sense, because even though it had passed officially, what was the received his jurisprudence on statute of limitations, there was a living survivor who they could identify as a victim who they could pay something to. So they did, and of course it's a complex of reparations, including symbolic reparations and so on. And internationally, I mean, the problem, however, I mean, that case is both the success of that case is also shows how difficult it is in some sense, because you have to have a discrete event with clearly identified perpetrators and victims, and you're depending on a legal process which has focuses in the human rights field primarily on physical harm such as killing, torture, and disappearances. So it's very difficult to speak about. So that's only one dimension of the afterlives of slavery. So it has a particular limit. So South Africa, Peru, Colombia, many countries have had very different approaches to reparations, and the most extensive, outside of Germany giving reparations post-Holocaust, and even that, to the Jewish community and Israel, but not to, for instance, the Roma. But outside of that, probably the most extensive reparations have mostly been in Latin America. So Colombia, for instance, has included cash payments, land restoration, memorials, procedures for victims to get access to health, education, and other benefits. Mike mentioned land, and land is, I mean, that's one of the problems with the South African reparations, right? That it was cash, it wasn't land redistribution. And so there's a lot of unfinished business, as it were, with the reparation story there. Let's see what else to say. I mean, in 2001, there was a World Conference Against Racism that was convened by the United Nations in Durban. And it was the global policy stage that was arguably the moment in sort of recent memory where the international community gathered to do something. And especially those governments that were responsible, including those governments, everyone was going to be there. And that was a a situation or a conference where the African Union and many countries from the global south had organized and prepared, and of course activists, various social movements, for that to be the place where people speak about reparations for the long history of colonialism and slavery and genocide. But the US, the UK, Israel, these countries and many other European countries, they pushed back. They said the past is past, and ended up just giving some anemic apologies and expressions of regret. But so that has not come on the world stage again. Although I think now CARICOM has put it on the table. The Caribbean countries have come with a collective demand for reparations, including questions addressing slavery, genocide, the histories of and the way the Caribbean in particular has been affected, thinking about rewriting debt as reparations, and a whole range of other kinds of things that combine material, financial, symbolic, structural, issues around the terms of trade, all of these things in some sense.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Nesiah. So my next question is for Dr. Ralph. Oops, sorry. So thinking about our own positionality, not only as students or faculty at New York University, but also thinking about how we function and move within the general vicinity of New York City, I was wondering how you conceptualize reparations for us as this kind of quote unquote diverse community.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I feel like I'm learning so much from these questions and also from my colleagues. And I think that, this idea of creative accounting is really important, I think, for people of color and people who have historically been marginalized. I think at one level it's even central to kind of like feminist critiques of capitalism, and like, for instance, like how the domestic sphere in a given household has historically been sort of undervalued or deemed a site absent of value, but meanwhile it sets the stage for someone to go into the workforce to be able to generate value. I think how we think about how the work we're doing is valued or not valued is very important. And I think, there's a disproportionate sort of burden on faculty of color, and in particularly sort of women and people who are gender nonconforming, to do a lot of the sort of counseling and therapeutic work at a given university, and especially at NYU. So I think how we think about the work people are doing and how we value that is essential. And not valuing that often means that people are sort of measured against a rubric that's unfair, and yet not giving credit for all the important work that they're doing. But I also think that what this means for us in New York and NYU is, suggesting that I like to approach things in an actuarial way. And I also think that in many ways, things are already that way. Like, I think the groups that have been historically marginalized tend to have lower life expectancy, higher rates of mortality, even sort of maternal mortality, tend to sort of to face, stop and frisk, disproportionate arrest and sentencing and incarceration, and tend to sort of live in food deserts and have a higher incidence of certain kind of health problems as a result, and things like that. So from an actuarial standpoint, it's like they are less likely to live long, healthy lives, less likely to have certain kinds of opportunities. So, and I think even the fact that police can kill unarmed Black people with impunity is partly because they know, just in concrete terms, their lives don't have a very high monetary value, and that there's not even much repercussions for that. Like, there are people who've been shot at, like white people shot at by the police, or had their homes unfairly raided by the police and sued and won millions of dollars, and Black people who are unarmed killed by the police and not been awarded millions of dollars to their families. And so I think it's incumbent on us to think about how all of these things are sort of always living with us and always part of sort of how we interact and socialize, and then sort of demand that these things are part of how we navigate even this space of the university. Like, when we hear a statistic like, okay, women are paid 70 cents on the dollar to men, why don't we ask that then chairs of departments or deans or provosts pull up pay scales and establish whether women of the same rank are paid 70 cents on the dollar to men in a university setting? Like, I think the things we're talking about in a social justice context can inform and should inform how we operate even as a community. And I think that there's no reason why we can't seek to remedy these things to the extent that we can kind of control our own space and our own community.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ralph. This next question is specifically for Dr. Funk. HR 40 was mentioned earlier tonight. And I guess on the topic of reparations, as it's kind of entered more into the political mainstream, we saw it as like a topic in 2020 presidential electoral discourse. Before that, in 2019, with the Congressional House Judiciary Committee held a hearing on HR 40 as a piece of legislation. Do you see the Biden-Harris administration prioritizing the passage of HR 50, which is the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act? And if not, what sort of legislation do you think fits within this mode of reparative justice, or this label of reparative justice?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have a high dose of skepticism when it comes to politics. And I think oftentimes a lot of these initiatives, they rise up during election years. I think even the case of Congress, of the 300 folks who were voting, not even half of them supported reparations, right? And not even half of the demographics, or just about half of the Democrats actually supported reparations in some form or fashion. So I do symbolically think there is going to be a conversation and a dialogue continues. And I don't want to minimize that. Having a conversation is a part of the healing process. And so there are elements to it psychologically, because understanding psychologically also impacts who we are physiologically as well. And so in terms of addressing trauma, having conversations, people taking ownership, it's necessary. Do I think it is going to come in the form or implementation of reparations? No, I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I just talked about in terms of affirmative action, right? And so given the political climate and the misunderstanding and misuse of the language of reparations, I'm not comfortable or confident to say that I think it's going to happen on a federal level. But I think what I've learned from some of my more recent sheroes, like Stacey Abrams, for instance, and what she was able to do in Georgia, I do think there will be changes and implementations that do happen on a state level and also on a local level. So I have more trust in that process, whether it's again through these legalization reforms of cannabis, whether it's through reform or defunding or repurposing of the police, whether it's through tuition drives, through higher education, right? Either tuition remission or some type of earmarking. I think it can happen more at a local level, but at a federal level, I don't believe it's going to happen. And I'm typically a kind of a uncurable optimist.
Thank you so much, Dr. Funk. So this is our last professor-specific question, and it is for Dr. Nesiah. So I was wondering, just thinking about the course of our conversation and how we've discussed reparations in other contexts, and how in the United States there is precedence for reparations in terms of financial compensation for groups that have been harmed. I was wondering why you think the discussion of reparations for Black Americans in the United States is viewed as exceptional in relation to other countries that have granted reparations to various communities.
It is viewed as exceptional, of course, by the US government. Or another way of putting it is that the US exceptionalism is part of how US empire projects itself at home and abroad, right? So that the US government has used, therefore, this notion as both sort of shield and as a weapon. Consider this, for instance, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think I taught both of you in my human rights classes, Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948. But on both sides of that, there were important petitions taking Black American grievances to the international community. In 1947, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, and others in the NAACP submitted a 100-page petition to the United Nations titled "A Statement on the Denial of Human Rights to Minorities in the Case of Citizens of Negro Descent in the United States of America, and an Appeal to the United Nations for Redress." In 1951, the Civil Rights Congress submitted a petition titled, and by this time UDHR had passed, submitted a petition titled "We Charge Genocide" that made a case from the history of slavery, lynching, very well documented and so on, and other atrocities. These were, amongst other things, making a case for reparations. Of course, neither of these petitions went anywhere, and they were defeated not just by the right, but crucially by white liberals. Right? So people who are celebrated for the human rights field, in the human rights field, like Eleanor Roosevelt, they didn't want any of this coming to the international community. And when I teach these documents in my classes, students say they have never heard of these, so that the history of Black internationalism has itself been buried. So that's there is a counter history that we need to learn from and keep alive. From Malcolm X to Du Bois to Nina Simone, arguably, they didn't always use the language of reparations. They were all invested in thinking and acting on reparations as a policy of refusal that was, in their own way, red, green, and international, as Rudy Gilmore says. But the one last thing I'll say is that, in Canada, one of the, where they've just had, or it's still ongoing, a reparations program for, the children who were stolen from First Nations communities and put in white schools and otherwise. So they had a Truth Commission process and reparations, which includes financial grants. I think maybe it's 40,000 Canadian dollars, something for those children. I can't remember the exact figures, but one, and various kinds of things to First Nations communities in Canada. But one of the most interesting things, and which I'm particularly interested in, of course, as a legal scholar, is that every single law class that's taught in Canada has to include Indigenous law. So you're teaching property law, you have to have at least one day that does Indigenous approaches to property law. You're teaching family law, you have to have at least one day that speaks to Indigenous approaches to family law in whatever jurisdiction you happen to be in, wherever in Canada you're teaching it, and whatever First Nations communities are present there. So, there is, in addition to all the other kinds of violence, there is certain epistemic violence that is important to redress, and so knowing some of the history, and also knowing that that different groups, different people of color have had both very complex histories with each other, sometimes in tension, sometimes in solidarity, and that this also needs to be both investigated and kept alive, and we need to figure out ways to build those solidarities.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Nesiah. So our last question for this one's open to the entire panel as we're talking about, epistemic violence, empire. Two-part question we want to pose to y'all is, do you think reconciliation for Black Americans is ever possible while we live under US empire? And then also related to that, as we talked earlier tonight about ideas of carcerality, what points of connection do you see between the call for reparations and the calls for prison industrial complex abolition, or more specifically, as it's been mentioned tonight, to defund the police?
I think this is a really important question, because I think that, it's fair to say that reparations is an issue that's taken up more, let's say, on the progressive wings of the political spectrum. But I think even amongst people who understand themselves to be progressive or liberal or something, they don't necessarily share the same view of what a just society looks like, right? And I think, for instance, President Obama would say that his goal would be to sort of level the playing field. But even saying that assumes that something like a kind of modest policy reform creates this sort of egalitarian landscape in which everyone is kind of free to compete and may the best person win. And of course, this is sort of one of the biggest illusions that fosters inequality, this idea of meritocracy, that the outcome is based on someone's sort of gifts or talent or effort or something like that, rather than these various kind of structural features of society. And so I think that what you're pointing us toward, I would say, I don't think that modest policy reforms, like the kind of legislation we're hoping for, could ever deliver something like justice. I think justice is much more robust and requires much more action on the ground, and the kind of forcing people to grapple with the magnitude of inequality, and the kind of insist on transforming society. Like, I think it's worth remembering that even after sort of the Civil War was over, it took the Union Army to occupy the South to enforce Reconstruction, you know? And after civil rights successes, it took the National Guard to escort Black children to school for them to be able to go to school safely, right? So it usually requires a massive federal intervention to guarantee certain rights. And I think that we should be really ambitious in how we think about executing a certain agenda if we indeed believe that it's fair and just. But I think that what the conversation about reparations can do for us is help us, as we've been discussing, to kind of envision the kind of government we want. But also, I think as a kind of methodology, reparations is important, like how we understand history, how we think about accounting for injustice. And in a quite literal way, I think reparations is a powerful methodology. So a lot of the research I've done on slavery and insurance was in part made possible by the reparations movement and by legislation passed initially in California and then Illinois, insisting that financial institutions have to disclose their historic relationship to the slave trade. And that's how we get records from certain firms that say, okay, we in this former incarnation of our company had these antebellum policies on enslaved people, or even after emancipation, we acquired these companies that had these policies going back to these dates. And so that helps us to create a kind of paper trail for understanding sort of the kind of wealth that's built up over generations through slavery and colonialism. And I sometimes think to myself, like, you know, in the same way as Mike touched on, that African Americans increasingly are discovering more about their ancestry through like 23andMe or something like that. I sometimes wish there was like a kind of financial version of 23andMe for like individual families or corporations where like you put in your tax records and it shows you your historic relationship to the slave trade, you know? Because essentially that's, I think, what we're talking about when we talk about accounting and accountability is like, how can we trace how this wealth was built up over generations and therefore who's liable for these injustices, and then like how we can sort of deliver some semblance of justice given the kind of wealth that's been concentrated in certain arenas of society or even certain families and certain firms, you know. But I think that what I don't think that we can expect a kind of just society to come out of these debates or these policy proposals, but we can get a sort of more comprehensive, nuanced understanding of history. And also it can kind of set the stage for a much more ambitious political project where we take these issues up, but then also sort of hold elected officials accountable, hold school systems and universities accountable for what they're teaching and how they recruit students and faculty or fail to recruit students and faculty. So I think it can be like the basis or kind of impetus for a more ambitious political project.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Michael. And you know, I always say that the answers are here in front of us. The answers are here at NYU. The answers are on the Zoom call. And so I think it's to be determined. And what is the work that we're willing to put forward to see justice realized, right? Uh, a year ago, I would not have believed that they would take down the Confederate flags in South Carolina state at the Capitol. I did not think that would happen. Um, I recall Daniel Snyder, the owner of the Washington racial epithet team, football team, once quoted himself saying, "I will never change the name of my football team," using the word never. And now it is, in fact, the Washington football team. So I do want to honor the transgression and progression that has happened in terms of the movement. And this movement that's happened within the last even just year has been significant. It is historic how we have actually, in fact, moved the needle. And so one of the things I was inspired about what happened in Georgia in recent elections is kind of the reinvigorating of young people who I think have been rightfully jaded or feeling disconnected, connection or disillusioned with the political process. And so folks are going to be, younger generations are going to come up, they see what's happening. So, you know, I'm hopeful in terms of folks really holding government officials accountable to making those changes. You know, I think we need to work on our spheres of influences. Mine is at in the institution of higher education, where I literally see changes happening oftentimes from the ground up. 2015, you had the watershed moment, the listening symposium here at NYU, right, where students poured out their hearts and testified about their experiences around egregious behaviors that happened, particularly around racial hostility. And 99% of that was happening in the classroom. As a result of students kind of being courageous, sharing their experiences, storytelling. You know, we now have the CDO, and Lisa Coleman, who's doing amazing transformative work. We have a bias response line. This is the most diverse racial and excellent, academically excellent class ever at New York University. So we understand, and there is now a precedent for diversity and excellence, right? These are things that I wouldn't have imagined, you know, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, right? And it's happening. So I am optimistic, inspired if we continue to do the work. And one of the things we didn't talk about much is K through 12 education. And it's interesting, oftentimes when I get students in college, many of them are not aware of redlining that took place or everything that Ta-Nehisi Coates outlines in A Case for Reparations. If you think of these racial restrictive covenants, where we dropped the ball with the New Deal in terms of the GI Bill and affirmative action for whites and not for folks of color. So, you know, Carter G. Woodson, the miseducation of the Negro, well, there's really been a miseducation of society. And how can we now, this generation, start really informing? And I, you know, I'm optimistic. I have a 7-year-old. He knows things about social activists that it took me about 20 years to know and learn, right? So there is a cultural, there's a paradigm shift in terms of knowledge, folks seeking knowledge and truth telling. So because of that, you know, to answer your first question, I think there is hope that we can attain some form of justice, restorative justice for folks of color, particularly Blacks in the US.
Um, yeah, you know, in within the human rights field or transitional justice field, sort of reconciliation is sort of a funny word, maybe even a sort of a dirty word. In some countries, in Argentina, for instance, victims saw the word reconciliation as sort of a word for blood money, of being denied justice, and of closing the books on the past in some sense. So, you know, yeah, I mean, I didn't know about what reconciliation entails. Sometimes it can be a Trojan horse for exactly that, for derailing the more radical justice claims. And I agree with Michael that it's important to be really ambitious, because I think, you know, the reason we have seen the change we have seen over the last year, the paradigm shift that Mike mentioned, was because people were ambitious, and when there was an opportunity, people had already thought and done a lot of work. It wasn't only the work of the summer. There was so much work before that that had happened, that prepared the ground, that that educated all of us, and that had and so that, you know, people could walk through that door when it opened. So I do think that it is really important to be ambitious. And similarly, I mean, taking up the themes that both Michael and Mike mentioned about education and research as an important area, I do think, as Michael says, it's important to sort of research all of the details in some sense of how these histories have lived. And sort of Mike also spoke about the importance of incorporating much of that into our educational system, you know, from the ground up. And that seems to be like, again, one, you know, in addition to all the various policy sort of steps, this is one other step. You know, and of course, all of this depends on sort of social movements sort of taking the lead and pointing us to the directions in which we should go. And I do see reparations talk and abolition talk as just two different dialects of the same conversation about the afterlives of slavery, genocide, and colonialism. So let's stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for your responses. So now we're going to pivot to the Q&A section. So the first one that I see is from Delio Vasquez. They write, I'm interested in hearing even more about the tensions between the ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery position, African Americans' own investment in American exceptionalism in American business, and the long global history and present of the enslavement of African diasporic people across the Western Hemisphere and beyond. What might it mean to attain, quote, justice within these borders while the US economy functions as empire?
I mean, I've certainly been, and I think we touched on this a bit earlier, but I've certainly been alarmed by how how divisive the discussion about reparations has been at times within the U.S. about certain groups deserving reparations, other groups not, even while all groups are kind of racialized in similar ways. Um, of course, again, like I think it is fair to sort of think about what makes these histories distinct, and even it could be possible to have tiers of um, different tiers of redress. Like, maybe not all groups get the same thing, because Mike spoke earlier about sort of how people identify versus how long they lived in the country versus all kinds of other criteria. Um, and, a reparations framework could be as complicated as a tax code, in deciding who gets what. And I'm fine with that because I think that ultimately it's about sort of the project of achieving redress and trying to kind of even address this historical injustice and this wrong. But I think that at the end of the day, the reparations framework should be shaped by our broader political vision. Is it one of sort of unity and harmony and justice? And if so, it should be informed by that. And one last thing I'll say is a colleague. I was on the reparations panel a few weeks ago with a colleague from Jamaica, who's a geographer, and he pointed out that a lot of the people brought to the U.S. who were enslaved were first brought to Jamaica for like seasoning and a breaking in kind of process and thing like that. So even the notion of who is where and who winds up where is rather more complicated. So many people of African descent or from the African diaspora went one part at some other moment in the journey and wound up somewhere else. So I think we have to be thoughtful. And then of course, because of U.S. imperialism, we are talking about global corporations who've been very ambitious in how they've extracted wealth from multiple sort of constituencies of African people, and so we should also think about how we would adjudicate those issues.
Yeah, I just, in terms of due diligence, I appreciate bringing up the ADOS. Is this something in terms of learning more about this topic and it's more contemporary? I know Antonio Moore and Yvette Carnell are really supporting that process. I don't know enough to completely address that, but I do, like Michael was talking about earlier, this Pan-Africanist approach. And I do know once you step into the United States, you become racialized, right? And so folks from Africa who may have dominant Black cultures, they may not have thought about race, or it may not be salient in a particular way. But to be sure, once you're in the US, no, however limited time, you understand kind of what oppression looks like. So I do like this notion of a tiered system. And I think William Darity has also argued this as well. So some of us who may have been able to at least demonstrate that we have one ancestor that was an enslaved African, that type of recourse might look different, or restitution might look different for someone who is more contemporary. Like you think of the family members of Kamala Harris, for instance, right, who were kind of born outside of the United States. But it doesn't mean that she didn't face discrimination. I mean, if you think about it from really since de jure segregation was eradicated in 1964, the state of Black America is actually, in terms of wealth, health outcomes, education, the same, if not worse, right? So I think there are still claims for some type of restorative justice to happen, or some reparations to happen for that group as well.
Maybe the only thing I would add, I mean, I don't know as much as Mike and Michael about this debate, and don't feel qualified to intervene in that. The only thing I would say, I guess, is that white supremacy and capitalism are sort of demonic twins that were born together, and fighting one means fighting the other too. So, so I don't know. That's something of a response to one dimension of what Delio was asking.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. We have one more question from the audience. It reads, thank you so much to this excellent panel for your expertise and sharing your knowledge. What about medical discovery reparations? Henrietta Lacks transformed medical research, and it doesn't seem like the full extent of the situation was fully explored. Does anyone have any immediate responses, or even more broadly about what reparations could look like within the medical profession, I guess, considering this moment of COVID we're living in as well.
Yeah, I do. I mean, briefly, I'll say that first, I think the Henrietta Lacks situation, it was, tragic in a number of different levels. One of them being sort of her own family story of sort of grappling with, generations of slavery and its afterlife in the U.S. South, but then also making its way to Baltimore, where there's a kind of very vexed and even sort of predatory relationship between an institution like Johns Hopkins University and the surrounding Black community, to the point where Black people are often scared to go to Johns Hopkins for any kind of medical care, or feel like they're part of some kind of experiment or nefarious experiment if they wind up there, or something like that. And harkening back to things like Tuskegee. And I think, so there, I think there's an opportunity for a university to conceptualize and grapple in a very tangible way with its relationship to surrounding community, in this case, largely African American. But then also, I think it goes back to this question of imperialism and capitalism and how we think about the corporation, because, even as faculty, right, when we have research fellowships on a given year, when we're exempt from teaching for a research fellowship, and we end up at some kind of either supported by a foundation or by an institution where we're in residence, we usually have to sign paperwork saying that all our discoveries while we're on fellowship are the property of the fellowship sponsor, which is interesting, right? Because essentially that means that the university is claiming intellectual property, right? And so in this case of medical discovery, given all the patents and inventions, and even sort of what's more music or literature, but then also scientific inventions and patents and things that Black people either sort of pioneered or were extracted from them, that is also wealth that has been extracted from the community. You know what I mean? So I think one form of reparations is sort of acknowledging the kind of intellectual property and the creativity um, and the expertise of people of color and marginal people in the U.S. or African Americans. So I think that that example is a very important example, because in a lot of these court cases, the ruling winds up being something like the person's body was just the raw material, but really the scientists were the ones who deserve credit for the invention and thus deserve to make all of the money, when there's no reason it couldn't be viewed differently, that the person who, one, had to suffer the kind of medical affliction that became the basis for scientific discovery, but also was subjected to the scientific procedures, also deserves to share in the wealth, And I think that that's why it is important, as arcane as it can be, and even as both unsatisfying and problematic as it can be to engage with things like the tax code or sort of capitalism and how it works. I think it is at times important to get into the weeds just to make sure that people get what they deserve. And because it's been such a vexed process for marginalized people to build wealth in this country.
I have not much to add, but just a resource. There's an incredible book called Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington that talks about kind of the development of iatrophobia, or this inclination to be fearful of the medical professions for folks of color, based on the history of, again, being misused and exploited by researchers and folks in the medical field. And I would say part of I learned recently the HR 40 is providing access to mental health services in terms of this reparation movement. And so I think, which is very connected to, again, the prison industrial complex and how we often criminalize poverty and particularly mental health issues. And we understand that Black men are 4 times more likely to be misdiagnosed with schizophrenia, right? So I think of even in terms of disability as well in the schools. So my students who are in predominantly minority schools, particularly Blacks, they are underrepresented in terms of folks being able to discover disability. And if in their predominantly white schools, they're overdiagnosed, right? So I think these are things that we need to be attuned to in terms of supporting the specific population of students.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Michael and Mike's comments, and the Michael sort of elaborated really nicely. I do think healthcare is sort of one of those areas that we should also think of within a reparations framework, and certainly providing universal healthcare. People have spoken about having a people's vaccine, that actually is not about rewarding the medical companies that have patents on these things, but making these things accessible in a whole range of different kinds of ways, even globally, so that we do have in now essentially a global health apartheid in terms of who has vaccine and who hasn't. So I do think addressing healthcare as sort of a basic element of dignity that was robbed by not just slavery, but the system that has been built on it.
Fantastic. So we're going to take this one last question before we close out. So someone was wondering if you have any advice or resources or scholars to recommend for K through 12 educators who are trying to change the curriculum they teach so that the next generation of Americans learn all of the history you've discussed here today.
Mike, I think that's your.
I'm higher education, but I'm currently reading what's abolitionist teaching, Bettina Love. She has this radical abolitionist framework that I recommend. And there's a book called Ghosts in the Schoolyards.
Oh yeah, it's by Eve Ewing.
Yeah, by Eve Ewing. It's also another K through 12 centered book that I would recommend.
Yeah, I mean, I actually feel like I would encourage the person who asked the question to reach out to us individually. And I think our emails are pretty straightforward if you just sort of Google us in NYU, or our names in NYU, because I love this question. And I think, it's a kind of a shame that it often feels like you have to do a doctorate just to learn what is the most rigorous history or something like that. It's like, I feel like so much of what we learn in primary, secondary education is kind of just kind of bull-faced lies, or things like that. And so I think this is a great question, because it can be hard, I think, to access what historians think of as like the most current research, or sort of, or ways to think and talk about these issues. And I think many of us have given talks to different kinds of audiences that would be happy to do that as well. I mean, there are things I can think of, like I think Pedagogy of the Oppressed obviously is an amazing book. I think Asada's autobiography is amazing and really interesting. So I think there's all kinds of resources we can name, but I also think we can be available as resources for this as well.
Bell Hooks teaching too, transgress. Yeah.
Yeah. And as Michael said, our emails are on the NYU website. So yeah, feel free to be in touch.
Awesome. So I wanted to ask if you panelists had any closing remarks for our audience.
I mean, I just feel honored by the invitation and very excited to have been in this conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and it was a really nice experience. And, I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about is just sort of like, the humanity of people. And it's like, no one should ever have to like insist on their humanity or insist on equal treatment. And, we're aware that injustices will take place because people benefit from them, and people often don't want to come to terms with them. But I think once we grapple with this, I think that it makes sense then for us to figure out what we can do to redress them.
I just want to appreciate the invitation. I want to appreciate Dylan and Kayla specifically. One of the things I learned in terms of having mentors and women mentors, oftentimes you look up to them, or you look side by side. And so Kayla is one of those folks who is a young woman tour of mine. I'm very inspired by the actions that she takes, and she inspires me not only to be a better professor, but a better person. So I want to appreciate that. And I just want to say, like, one of the things I appreciate about being on the panel, it just has me remaining in the conversation. So let's stay in the dialogue. Let's stay in the conversation. One of the things I used to make a habit of is like, so for instance, I remember going to the Freedom Center, the Harriet Tubman Freedom Center in Cincinnati, and asking them, so do I get a reparations way fee as someone who's African American? Why am I having to pay to go to the Freedom Center? Why would I have to pay to go to the National Museum of African American History in DC? When I'm in Harlem, I feel like I should be able to cut the line and order the first round at the bar, right? So, and I used to be really frustrated in Harlem. I would say, I would go in and I would see folks who are white folks who are the bartenders, folks who have all these positions, who they might be the host or the manager, and then you see black folks like cleaning tables and having tough questions about that, even in our neighborhood. So I think asking questions, staying in the conversation is really, really important moving forward.
Yeah, I also just want to add my thanks to Dylan and Kayla for a really great conversation, and to Mike and Michael. I also learned so much, and I appreciate the conversation. And I just want to echo what Mike said about, in some sense it starts local. That how we think about reparations, or how it becomes something that's not just some abstraction, but something that's very important in our daily lives, is about how we think about the various, whether it's we thinking about NYU and sort of issues that are in front of us at NYU. We were talking about like the Martin Luther King Scholars Program. All of these things are things that we need to act on, and that things that have an urgency as well. So thank you again, guys.
Yes, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate you, Dr. Funk and Dr. Rao, for being with us here today and sharing all your knowledge. I know I gained a lot, and I hope everyone who attended did as well. We also want to extend special thanks to Sharice Taylor, Mike Gomez, and the entire support of the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora for help making this possible. We also want to thank the members of the Black Student Union, as well as everyone who attended this event. We really appreciate your time and attention tonight. So quickly before we close out, I wanted to plug a distinguished faculty lecture featuring Miriam Kaba that will be happening next month. I just put the link for it in the chat, but the topic will be Abolition Feminism is a Practice of Freedom, which kind of touches on some of the themes that we discussed here tonight. So would definitely recommend attending if you are available. And yeah, thank you everyone so much for coming tonight, and have a great rest of your night. Bye.